Hey, it's Jared. In this video, I'm going to talk about my experiences with the Sirui 40mm Anamorphic Prime. This is also an autofocus lens, which makes it extremely useful where typically anamorphic lenses are manual, and manual focus means things are tricky. And so what did I do? I took this lens to my son and my daughter's basketball games and shot a bunch of footage to see how responsive the autofocus was, and just see what kind of footage I could grab. And I have to say, I was pleasantly surprised with this lens. First of all, just take a look at the lens. It's pretty compact. I mean, it's 40mm anamorphic. It does have a crop built into it. It is a S35 Super 35 lens, and so that 40mm is becoming a bit more telephoto than it would be otherwise. But it has an autofocus lock on the side. We also have an autofocus and manual focus switch. We've got a nice big gear here for our focus, and then we also can adjust our aperture manually or put it in automatic mode. And so if you are more of a hybrid shooter, maybe you shoot a little bit of video here and there, and you've been thinking about getting into anamorphic, this really is an interesting lens for you to jump in with, because it has a lot of the features that you would expect out of pretty much any other lens that you're used to shooting photography with, and maybe shooting video using automatic settings. So this lens is definitely a stepping stone. It gets you that anamorphic look without all of the anamorphic complexity. And so let's just look at the other side. We can also de-click or click. And so with the click on, we have stops, and with de-click off, it's just a smooth rack. And so this makes it useful if you are wanting to adjust your exposure, which of course, adjusting your exposure using the aperture ring is also going to adjust your depth of field, but you can feather your exposure a little bit by using the de-clicked aperture ring, which is a great way, because otherwise your only other options are to adjust your shutter speed or your ISO, and you will see stops in that. And so for me, if I need to adjust some exposure, I would rather adjust my exposure with a de-clicked aperture wheel here, and maybe just go from 4, just slightly feather it down to 5.6 just to darken the scene up a little bit. So it's nice to have that functionality. Now, I was thinking with autofocus, it can't really be that great, because this is just a different type of lens. I didn't have high expectations out of the gate, but I have to say, it kept up. And even in a busy basketball game where you've got people running in and out of each other, the camera did a good job of maintaining lock. Obviously, the lens doesn't have anything to do with who the camera is going to choose to lock onto, but the lens does have a lot to do with how fast focus is going to move and whether or not it can keep up with what the camera is throwing at it. Now, I used it on the A7C II, and I also used it on the A1 Mark II, and I put it on the FX3 a couple of times and shot some stuff with that as well. So I've used it on a variety of Sony cameras, and I have to say the performance has just been great on all of them. I love the A7C II because it's super compact, and I could just carry this in my bag and have it available and shoot cool anamorphic stuff pretty much any time. But then if I want to put it on a camera that has maybe better low light that I typically rig out a little bit more, I could put it on the FX3. And then when I'm shooting mainly photos and maybe hybrid shooting, it's often that I'm using the A1 Mark II, and bringing this lens along means that I can get some creative shots, just throw it on the camera, even shoot some 6K on that camera as well. It's just fantastic to be able to do that. And this lens makes it definitely more accessible to where I don't have to think through anything. It's just, I want to get some shots that are a little bit different, throw the lens on, get those shots, switch back to another lens, and get back to what I was doing. And being that it is S35, it's obviously going to work on full frame Sony cameras as well as APS-C cameras. So let's talk about the build quality. I feel really secure with this lens. It has great build quality. I'd say the only thing that's a little bit annoying is that when you are hand holding your camera, your knuckles are just right here on the gear. And so my knuckle is just always on the gear. And as I'm moving my finger around, it's just rubbing on my knuckle. And so there just isn't a whole lot of clearance when it comes to this particular camera body. But when I put this lens on the FX3 or even the A1 Mark II, that's not an issue because of the different shape and the ergonomics of the camera. There's a bit more room for the grip there, and I don't run into that problem. But on this small camera body, it's something to notice. Other than that, it does have an 80mm front, and so if I wanted to mat this up and put some filters in front of it, I could definitely do that. And so this lens is easy to rig out because of the design and the shape, but it also has 77mm filter threads. So if you want to thread something onto the front, perhaps an everyday filter from Polar Pro, which is one of my favorites, you can easily do that. So Sirui covered a whole lot of bases with this lens because for those of us that want an anamorphic lens, something we could throw on and just get creative shots without having to get too complex, it nails it for that. But then we can also throw this lens in manual. We could put a matte box on the front of it. We can rig the camera up and we can get anamorphic shots that way as well. So this lens does come in two types of flares, a natural and a blue flare. And so you have two different options when you order the lens. I opted to go for the natural because I wasn't going to be shooting at night and looking for that blue flare off of headlights or any of the, traditional stuff that you would see from a anamorphic lens. I simply wanted the anamorphic crop. I wanted the anamorphic look to the kind of the filmic look that you can get from an anamorphic lens that you just can't get when I'm shooting with other Sony lenses. So the flare wasn't even really super important to me. It was really more of the look of the footage. Now, when you're shooting with the A7C II, it doesn't have a built-in desqueeze mode, and so everything does look kind of squished, and that can be a little bit trickier to frame up your shot on the back of the camera. However, a lot of the other cameras like the FX3 and the A1 Mark II do have a desqueeze option, but then it bakes that into the footage, and I just really don't like that. I want the unsqueezed footage so that I can squeeze it in post and make any changes that I want to it there. But if you're buying this lens and looking for the feature, not all cameras have the ability to desqueeze the footage within the camera body. Some people definitely prefer to have the desqueezed option within the camera. It makes framing things up. What you see is what you get essentially on the back of the camera, but you can always desqueeze it later in post. It's very easy to do that in Final Cut, Premiere, Resolve. Most of them have built-in features for desqueezing, or you can just look up the conversion rate and you can desqueeze it manually by making adjustments to the height and the width of your image. But overall, it's a pretty simple process. I tried it both ways. There was some footage that I captured that I desqueezed in the camera, and most of the footage I captured on the A7C II, which means that the footage was not desqueezed in camera, and I did that in post when I was editing in Final Cut. So overall, I think this is a great value. I mean, this is not a lens that you're going to use every single day, but if you want that anamorphic look, you can't really get into it for much better of a price than this lens. With the adaptability of this lens, the way that it was built, can accept a matte box at 80mm, but we also have the 77mm filter thread. I mean, this lens hits all of the main points and is a very versatile lens. And you could even use it as a photography lens as well, although I would rather desqueeze in the camera for photography than have to manually adjust my photos in an editor to desqueeze them there, but you definitely could do that as well. And with autofocus, who doesn't love autofocus? It definitely makes things easier if the circumstances call for it. But that's going to do it for my review and my opinions of this Sirui 40mm Anamorphic Autofocus prime lens. Definitely something you got to have in your bag. Check out the links down in the description below. And I hope you found this video useful, so give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. We'll see you back in another one soon. Take care.